Thanks for joining us on a road trip through rabbinic narrative. No agenda, just clarity. Today we're going to take a look at a strange Aggadah found in Gemara Bava Basra, Daf Ayin Daled Amud Aleph 74a. This is part of a series of stories dealing with Rabba Bar Chana. And in this one in particular, Rabba tells us that an Arab merchant approached him and told him, "Come with me. I'm going to show you the place of those who were swallowed up with Korach." So Rabba followed him, saw two cracks in the ground which were emitting smoke. The Arab merchant took some wool, soaked them in water, stuck them on the head of a spear, and put them in between the cracks in the ground. When he pulled out the wool, they were singed. The Arab then said to Rabba, "Tell me what you hear." And Rabba responds that he heard they were saying, "Moshe v'soraso emes v'hein badain." Moshe and his Torah are true, and they themselves are deceitful, liars. And the Arab responded to him, "Every 30 days they get shaken up from Gehenna to be brought to the surface, like meat that is stirred in a pot." And they say exactly that. Moshe v'soraso emes v'hein badain. Moshe and his Torah are true, and they themselves are liars. Now, if you're like me, your first reaction might be, how does this Arab know where Korach and his crew were swallowed? Did he inherit some ancient map? Is this really what the Gemara is trying to teach us? That somewhere in the desert, there's a tourist attraction site that only one local Arab guide knows how to find? Another detail that I thought was worth thinking about was that the Arab merchant doesn't immediately tell Rabba what this place is or what's going on here. Instead, he performs some kind of demonstration by taking some wool, soaking it, putting it into the ground. What is this adding to the story? Also, why doesn't the Arab merchant simply say, "This is where Korach's crew is, and this is what they say"? Why ask Rabba to listen and tell him what they say? Just tell Rabba what's going on. He admits later that he knew that this is what they are proclaiming. So I think as a starting point, we can suggest that before we can understand what's actually happening here, we first have to appreciate that this isn't just another place in the desert. There's something very unusual here. Something beneath the surface is generating a tremendous amount of heat. And that's the first thing that the Arab merchant is showing Rabba, that this is a unique place that's worth investigating. Once he can show this to Rabba, then he invites him to listen and tell him what he hears. He, so to speak, creates the conditions for Rabba to be able to investigate himself. This struck me as significant because that's usually how we're able to learn about certain flaws that we have. You can't simply tell someone that they're wrong. You can't simply tell someone that they're acting like Korach, for example. Most of the time, someone's going to react very defensively and not be open to hearing it. Instead, you have to bring someone to the place, help them notice something unusual, make them curious, enable them to see it or hear it themselves. At the end of the Aggadah, the Arab tells Rabba that he hears this same declaration every 30 days. The usual way to read this is that somehow the Adas Korach is continually confessing to what they got wrong. But I wonder if Chazal are talking less about Korach and his crew and more about us. Maybe Korach isn't merely one individual who lived at the time of the Midbar, but Korach represents a recurring tendency within all of us. What's that tendency? To ask, why should we listen to this authority? Why should Moshe decide? Why should that Rab decide? Why not me? Why should authority rest with someone else when it comes to interpreting and transmitting Torah? These are the kinds of questions that never completely disappear. They settle beneath the surface until something stirs them up again. Maybe it's a situation where a leading rabbinic authority does something very questionable, or I encounter a halacha that just doesn't sit right with me, or there's a psak, a decision that I don't agree with. Suddenly, that whole Korach conversation returns. And maybe that's why in the Aggadah, that declaration repeats every 30 days. Because we need to bring it back to the surface. We, so to speak, need to stir the pot every once in a while so that we can address this particular complaint, this particular tendency that we have towards Torah authority, and make sure that we address it and correct it. This actually made me think about those famous midrashim that are brought at the beginning of Parshas Korach. Rashi brings them down, where Chazal tell us that Korach brought everybody to Moshe Rabbeinu and presented him with two halachic situations in order to basically demonstrate how ridiculous Moshe's rulings were. Case one that he presented was a talis shekulo techeles, right? A talis that is completely the color of techeles, doesn't need a techeles string. And case number two is a base medrash full of sefarim doesn't need a mezuzah. And in both cases, when Moshe responds in the affirmative, Korach essentially makes fun of him to show how ridiculous that sounds. I'm not convinced that Chazal are telling us that this is what actually transpired in the times of Korach. But I think that Chazal are showing us where Korach's arguments lead. Once Moshe's authority is rejected, eventually the authority of Torah Sheba'al Peh is going to become negotiable. Moshe wasn't just the leader of that time, but Moshe played an essential role in the transmission of both Torah Shebechsav and, perhaps more significantly, Torah Sheba'al Peh, the system of halacha. This reminded me of a very famous shir that was transcribed from the Rav, Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, that's referred to as the Common Sense Rebellion. He argues that Korach's rebellion wasn't simply against Moshe, but rather it was also against the very idea that Torah is transmitted through a very disciplined system of Masorah. So the modern version of Korach isn't someone who rejects Torah outright, but it's someone who says, I'll decide for myself what the Torah means and when it should apply. I'm going to use my own common sense, my own intuition, as to whether or not certain halachos are relevant nowadays. Whether or not the Rav had this Aggadah in mind when he was giving that shir, I think he's describing the same phenomenon. This could also explain why, after the whole event takes place, Hashem instructs Moshe to take the staff of Aaron, which blossomed overnight, and put it into the Aron as a sign for future generations. Why is this particular lesson preserved in such a concrete way in the Aron Kodesh alongside the luchos, the broken luchos, the jar of mun? If we played a little game together and said which one doesn't belong here, we'd probably all agree that the staff of Aaron would seem to be the outlier. But I think this Aggadah can help us explain that, which is that this particular challenge really never disappears. Every generation faces this and needs its own reminder. And maybe that's why the last Navi, Malachi, actually declares, Zichru Torahs Moshe Abdi. Remember the Torah of Moshe, my servant. Think about that. Even Hashem is calling it Moshe's Torah. Those are the very words that the Adas Korach, that Korach and his crew need to acknowledge. So just circling back to our Aggadah, perhaps this particular passage in the Gemara is coming to teach us that the philosophy of Korach and his followers is actually something that's buried beneath the surface of everybody's consciousness. And every so often, we need to bring it to the surface so that we can make it conscious, address it, and make sure we remind ourselves and declare Moshe emes v'soraso emes. Thanks so much for joining us. In our next episode, we're going to take a look at a medrash I remember learning as a child. Yaakov Avinu places stones beneath his head before going to sleep, and Chazal tell us that these stones argue over which one his head should rest upon until they suddenly become one stone. Is this really a story about miraculous stones? Or Chazal revealing something much deeper about the unique challenge Yaakov Avinu is about to face? See you on the next road trip.